Welcome to the Weird and Unexplained. I'm your host, John. Tonight, our journey takes you beyond the barbed wire fences and the government secrets of the Nevada desert into the hidden world of, you guessed it, Area 51, through the stories and scars of those who've worked within its shadows. Not spacecraft nor fantasy, but the haunting cost of secrecy on real lives and their bodies. Picture a road stretching from Las Vegas into a sun-baked wilderness where the landscape itself conspires to erase your memory of anything ordinary. This is the iconic route to Area 51, a passage that, for thousands of employees, became a commute into secrecy. The early mornings begin before the sun rises. The air is still, silhouettes of distant mountains, the only landmarks that can be seen. At the checkpoint, armed guards verify identities and remind everyone for the stakes. Remember, for silence is above all else. Inside the base, work occurs in windowless buildings and under perpetual security. For years, some employees served convinced that the strangest things weren't the aircraft themselves, but the utter absence of explanation for their duties. Job titles were vague, tasks were repetitious, but oddities crept in: chemical smells, occasional burns, rashes, and whispered questions that everyone was told to bury before a shift ended. The culture of need to know ran so deep that even basic concerns about one's own health or environment also became a taboo. Yet the work carried on, because in this environment, obedience and silence were the price of continued employment and perceived patriotism. Lifetimes of service were stacked in the classified files of base that officially didn't even exist. In the years after service, a pattern began to emerge for many who had worked inside Area 51's perimeter. Out of the silence and scattered across the country, some endured inexplicable health crises: sudden tumors, unusual cancers, neurological decline. The connection was at first indistinct. Could it really be linked to service so many years before in such an unmentionable place? But patterns persisted. When veterans found each other again, the sense of community was overshadowed by shared medical history. Their reunions became less about reliving the past and more about trading doctors' notes and recounting surgeries and comparing timelines of the disease. Each new illness was a puzzle piece suggesting something had been shared out there in the desert, something left unspoken but not undetected. Attempts to seek help exposed an even more sinister dimension. Official records were gone. Some service files were data masked or redacted beyond recognition. Applications for assistance met with denial. For the government, these people had never existed as an employee, and their service was a secret to be kept at all costs, even from themselves. Out of desperation and indignation, a handful of them became organizers and advocates fighting for answers, recognition, and compensation. Not just for themselves, but for their fellow ghosts left out of the history books. From this moment rose organizations determined to confront both denial and the wall of classification. Public pressure began, combining stories of harm with demands for transparency. The mission was daunting, not only to win medical aid, but to force the government to admit that these jobs, illnesses, and losses were quite real. They collected testimonies and built a mosaic of silence and suffering. It was not a conspiracy. They presented their evidence in the form of hospital bills, death certificates, and sworn affidavits. Even so, their efforts were repeatedly hamstrung by lack of documentation without official acknowledgement of hazardous service. Bureaucratic processes stalled, and families were left to bear the burden alone. For the wider world, though, Area 51's history was defined less by these struggles and more by the persistent shadow of extraterrestrial legend, a shadow that sometimes provided cover for more earthly tragedies. Area 51 vaulted into international consciousness in the late 1980s when one former worker claimed to have seen the unimaginable alien spacecraft, propulsion technologies, and materials beyond the periodic table. His story took hold, immediately polarizing audiences. Some heard confirmation of lifelong suspicions about the supernatural, others found the claim outlandish. All agreed, however, that the attention he garnered exposed him to consequences that swept beyond personal ambition. Employment records and credentials vanished or became inaccessible. Whatever the truth, whistleblowing provided was proving to be costly. For most employees, though reality was mundane by comparison, the myth of aliens became a remarkably effective misdirection, allowing the government to conduct hazardous aviation and defense research away from prying eyes and congressional oversight. This smokescreen was a convenience for that base, concealing the risks, the mistakes, and health fallout exposed by those who actually knew the truth about what secrets really meant. Area 51's best kept secrets weren't saucers in the hangars, but jets built at the outer limits of engineering. In the Cold War years, pilots and engineers tested the A-12 Oxcart and other aircraft known by only code names. No protective equipment shielded them from exposure to those new fuels or experimental composites. Success was measured in flights survived, not just in data charts. Fatalities and unexplained illnesses were frequent, but the testing continued in relentless pursuit of speed and stealth. For these workers, engineers, techs, and pilots, the legend of alien aircraft in the press conveniently overshadowed the very real suffering of families coping with early death and chronic disease. Admitting to high-tech aviation mishaps or radiation exposure would have been a public relations nightmare. The UFO stories were allowed to flourish, providing an innocent, if misleading, distraction. The pattern repeated across decades. Government secrecy collided with basic human needs, and those who sought redress were left adrift. Without documented history, former employees found themselves unable to find or to file claims, access those records, or prove their exposure. Health professionals struggled to understand rare diseases and strange symptoms. The result was profound isolation. Even within their own families, some former employees hesitated to explain the scope of what they had endured, afraid of violating oaths or facing social ridicule. Many simply bore the cost in silence, opting for quiet suffering over the risk of public exposure. Legal advocates, when they became involved, found themselves opposing an industrial bureaucracy whose records had been rendered impenetrable by design and whose priorities remained focused on secrecy above all. In the last decade, the silence around Area 51 has cracked ever so slightly. Congressional hearings, spurred first by veterans' testimonies and then by attention to the UAP, or known as the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, have glimpsed the cost of total secrecy. Still, barriers of classification and national security mean that the most explosive detail remains locked away in concrete. Relief for those affected lags behind rhetorics. Those who testify, military officers, intelligence veterans, surviving engineers, often do so at great risk. Repercussions can range from a career stagnation to sudden scrutiny in their private lives. Still, the act of speaking in a form of defiance, an attempt to wrest back some dignity from a system built to deny it. In these rare public forums, whispers of buried technologies and hidden tragedies mingle uneasily with lawmakers, promises, and the impatient hope of those who want to store fully told. Every year, for some, perhaps the only tradition that still binds them, former Area 51 workers gather quietly in the shadow of Las Vegas. These reunions are part healing, part mutual acknowledgement, a circle of survivors who knows what it's like to trade years for silence and to face consequences alone. The group mourns lost colleagues, supports newly diagnosed, and reviews old paperwork, hoping for any evidence that can move their case forward. They pass around photographs, patches, and pieces of decommissioned equipment, tokens of a history that otherwise remains officially unwritten. These moments are not just about nostalgia, but about endurance against erasure. They preserve memory, bear witness, and offer mutual support in a world that would rather forget them altogether. The story of Area 51 is not only a tale of technological achievement or paranormal rumor, but a cautionary lesson about what happens when secrecy eclipses accountability. The real legacy is hidden not in the sand and steel of the base, but in the families changed forever by exposure to unknown dangers, and by the agonizing experience of being told these dangers never existed. Some have dedicated their final years to advocacy. Others have moved on, hoping only for peace as the world continues to spin conspiracy and myth around the most formative experiences. We are left to ask, what does it mean to serve and be erased? Who pays the price for national defense when nobody is keeping score? And what lessons will be learned as the shadows of the Cold War lengthen into the future? At the end of it all, Area 51's greatest secret is the price paid by those who could never share in the legend. For the world, the base remains a black hole of speculation. For its workers and for their families, the cost has always been counted in silence, frustration, and in loss. Tonight, remember the real story beneath the rumors. The real people entered that desert, emerged changed, sometimes honored. Oftentimes, they were erased. What they risked, what they suffered, and what they fought to have recognized endures long after the runway lights have gone dark. This has been the Weird and Unexplained. I'm John, your host for this evening on this episode. Thank you for listening and for remembering the ghost who, for a moment, stepped into the light.